What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, we got a good one for you guys, with many, if not all of our drafts now in the rearview mirror. Many of us, as we're anxiously awaiting the first week of NFL action coming up this week, we're looking at our rosters, getting excited about the players, but also wondering if we made the right decision. What better time than to release the running backs you should have drafted video? If you missed the wide receiver version we released earlier on this weekend, definitely check that out. If you actually leave the draft and have any of these players in that video on your team, or even in this video, you can rest assured knowing that we think you made a really solid draft pick. Before we do get into the video though, just want to remind you guys that we're still posting content throughout the season, so if you're somebody new to the channel, what you can expect is waiver wire videos, positional starts and sits, so you'll know which running backs we're high on each week, which matchups we think are the juiciest. So if you're somebody who's followed our content, or even if you're a member, this is where things are really heating up on the website and where it will really pay off to be an all-in access member. So with that said, just because the draft is concluded, don't go anywhere. We have a full off season of content ready for you. If you do enjoy the videos we're putting out, all we ask in return is to hit that like button. It helps us grow the channel, and we're inching closer and closer to 100k subscribers. I literally think we're at about 99k right now. So thank you all for this support. Continue to follow along, and with that, let's hop over to the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was just one running back had more than 2 fumbles recovered last season. This player actually had 5. Which player was that? The correct answer was actually Kareem Hunt, so congratulations to Joseph Guidry, the first to get this right on YouTube. And as for Twitter, at Zion2149758. Once again, congratulations to both of you. But as for today's stat of the day, which team in 2020 lost the least amount of fumbles on the entire season? Once again, which team last year lost the least amount of fumbles? Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Alright guys, without further ado, let's hop right into the video. This is going to be a top 5 list, of course only consisting of running backs, and much like the wide receiver video, if you caught that, you'll know the format we're going to use, which is to choose a player going in each stage of the draft. So for wide receiver, we chose somebody who was being drafted as a wide receiver 1, moved into a wide receiver 2, then a wide receiver 3, so on and so forth. For running back, we're not going to be talking about an RB3, 4, or 5. Reason being, the position is just so front loaded. The players that are actually producing and the ones that you're going to want on your team, they're going in the early stages of the draft, most of them likely top 24 players. However, there is enough separation in each one of these players to where if you actually wanted to land each one of them on your team in a draft, it's certainly in the realm of possibility. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if one of you out there who's already completed your draft has 2, if not 3 or more players listed in this video already on your roster. To start, we'll begin with the least surprising stage of the draft where running backs are coming off the board. That's the first round. The player I chose to lead this list is Jonathan Taylor of the Indianapolis Colts. You will find out very quickly when making this list, it's not about finding the player who's going to produce the most fantasy points. Of course, if that was the goal, I would choose all 5 players to be Alvin Kamara, Dalvin Cook, Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey, and fill in the blank for the 5th option. No, I'm opting not to do that. But when it comes to the running backs that you should have drafted, I think combining their draft day price tag along with the value that they provide for your team, then just explaining what separates them from the other players that were being drafted around them that really makes them stand out as a player that you would regret not drafting, I think those are the players we could stand to gain the most when we actually look back at our fantasy rosters once the season's concluded. While Jonathan Taylor is unlikely to match the fantasy production 1-for-1 with Christian McCaffrey, Taylor himself is also not coming off the board as the first overall player for all of fantasy football. In fact, Jonathan Taylor himself is a player who's dipping into the 2nd rounds in some leagues. If you don't believe me, reference a short I posted about a week ago outlining some of the early round running backs that are coming in undervalued. Jonathan Taylor led that list because, as we all know, to start the offseason, he was coming off the board as a top 6 pick. This was the stage of the offseason where Ezekiel Elliott was being pushed out of the 1st round. In fact, quite a lot's changed since then, so much so that Ezekiel Elliott is once again regaining his RB1 status, pushing for that top 5. As for Jonathan Taylor though, the days of him rising up the draft boards and many people getting excited to draft him, those days are over. And when looking back at the reasoning for his drop in ADP, trying to make sense of it, there's really only one explanation. It all comes down to the health of Carson Wentz, also the health of all-pro guard Quentin Nelson, easily one of the best, if not the best at his position. No doubt in my mind that if neither of those players were starting for the team, Jonathan Taylor may not have deserved that 1st round round price tag. Immediately after hearing the news that both players could potentially miss up to 13 weeks, aka neither player may have seen the field again until about 10 weeks into the fantasy season. By that time, playoff spots are all but locked up, so it wouldn't be all that reasonable to draft Jonathan Taylor and be excited about the increase in production in 10 weeks. Rather, you should be prepared to be without either player for the entire season because there's always no guarantee that you'll even make it into the playoffs. So understandably, the excitement for the offense dwindled. Still a team that was well coached with a good defense, so Jonathan Taylor's value is not completely diminished. Ultimately, that landed him somewhere in about the second round, falling in some leagues, being reached on in others. As for my take at that time, I wouldn't really touch him. There are way too many good options at the running back position. We know 70% of every pick going in the first few rounds is going to be a running back, so there's no shortage of them in that stage of the draft. Why take one that has no guarantees when it comes to offensive upside? Heading into the season with a backup quarterback, an offensive line uncomparable to the season before, it was just a recipe that I didn't want to deal with. So the best choice in my mind when it came to Jonathan Taylor was simply opting to choose another player being drafted around him. Since then though, we've had massive news. Carson Wentz almost unbelievably had made it back to the practice field. Quentin Nelson also himself recovering miraculously quickly from surgery, much like Carson Wentz. Initially when we received that news and hearing that Carson Wentz could potentially start in week 1, I was questioning the source, wondering if it was correct, but soon thereafter we saw footage of Carson Wentz on the football field, not just taking part in a walkthrough, but doing high knees, showing off some athleticism, and all the news that we've received since then has fully supported that, and it looks as though Carson Wentz is going to be the starter for the team in week 1. With that news in my mind, Jonathan Taylor's draft stock immediately skyrocketed, nearly back to the position it once was. Personally, I don't think I could put him back to the 6th player off the board. I think Carson Wentz did show his true colors that he has shown throughout his entire career, that the team really can't rely on him to play for an entire 16-game season. I still don't think that's a reasonable expectation for him, and if we needed a reminder of that, this could definitely be looked at as that. When it comes to Jonathan Taylor though, his second round ADP should have immediately bounced back to the first round, and much to my surprise, in many leagues, Jonathan Taylor was still a player that was slipping down draft board. Using the ADP page on our website, you can see that Jonathan Taylor is not a first round draft pick in all platforms. Also, as mentioned in my release video of undervalued early round running backs, I did mention him in that video, and many people in the comment section were mentioning how they either got him in the second round or he fell to the second round but they were unable to get him. If for some reason you may not have had your fantasy draft yet and Jonathan Taylor is someone you can grab even as the first pick in the second round, even one of the last picks in the first round, pull the trigger on it. You're getting him at an amazing value. I do feel strongly that even if Carson Wentz does go down with an injury, as long as Quentin Nelson's there, I have no fear on Jonathan Taylor's production. As mentioned, it's a well-coached team, very strong defense. Even a young or inexperienced quarterback should not hold back his fantasy production. In fact, it may make the team rely on the running back position even more. Carson Wentz, like I mentioned, I'm not even guaranteeing he plays for a full 16 games. If I own Jonathan Taylor, I wouldn't be all that surprised to not have Carson Wentz for the fantasy playoffs, but having Quentin Nelson there is all that I would need to feel confident in his production. And when we compare where he's going in drafts right now as opposed to earlier on in the offseason, and with our expectations remaining virtually unchanged, the roster the same as it was at that point when he was ranked inside the top 6, why are some people still letting him slip into the second round, and why are other people that see him falling into the second rounds not jumping for joy at the opportunity to draft him there? Alright guys, we're moving into the next player, still sticking with the early rounds. In fact, this is a running back projected to come off the board in the second round. No surprise when it comes to why this player made the list, so I'm not going to take too much time on him because he's been a must-own player for us this entire offseason. We've had several videos where we've gone over him, discussed exactly what we liked about him. It's Najee Harris of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Currently, Najee Harris is going in a stage of the draft where many of you out there are going to have an opportunity to draft him. While I wouldn't recommend reaching on him and taking him with your first round pick, anybody with pick 11, pick 12 in a standard 12-team league can almost guarantee that they get him. Even players who are going to get pick 13 and 14 have a very solid chance to get him because he's going as late in drafts as pick 18. That's going to be his ADP on the platform Sleeper, one of the most popular platforms that we have to date. So unlike Jonathan Taylor, while we may be looking back on Taylor as a player that we wish we had on our roster, with him being drafted in the first round and sometimes being drafted in the middle of the first round, depending on our draft position, we may or may not have even had an opportunity to draft him. With Najee Harris, he's definitely a player that a lot more people have flexibility in drafting. So oftentimes when it comes down to who ends up with Najee Harris on their roster, roster, at the end of the day, it's going to be the person that wanted him the most. I know a lot of people are faced with the choices of players like Austin Eckler, Joe Mixon, Antonio Gibson, 3 very solid running backs in their own right. And if you're somebody who has had a back-end first-round pick, you know exactly the tough decision you've had to make across those 4 players. So that's why I mentioned when it comes to Najee Harris, typically the people that are able to draft him have the choice of drafting him. The only problem is many people are opting for other options that seem much safer, with Big Ben getting older, his arm last season not quite looking like it did in years past, already a player that had home road splits that were pretty enormous, not to mention he's a rookie. We're not sure exactly how he'll perform at the NFL level, or at least it's not guaranteed, and with him stepping in immediately behind a subpar offensive line, that does bring up questions as to how efficient he'll be. So when combining all of those factors, I can see why some people do opt to take those other rushers ahead of him, but that's also exactly why he made this list of running backs that we believe you should have drafted. I mean, if you think about it, outside of Joe Mixon, it's really difficult to find a running back with more of a guaranteed workload. The depth chart behind him, non-existent. And when it comes to how the Pittsburgh Steelers have handled the running back position historically under Mike Tomlin over the past decade plus, we know Najee Harris is immediately going to step in, play a true workhorse role, not only getting the early down work, not only getting the goal line work, but also being heavily used in the receiving game. And looking back at what he did in college, stepping into that workhorse role, being heavily involved in the receiving game, these are things he was already doing throughout those years. There won't be anything that the Pittsburgh Steelers are going to ask Najee Harris to do that he's not already completely comfortable with. I think we all can admit we got a first-hand look at that in preseason. I'm actually surprised that his draft day price tag and stock did not increase as a result. Typically, with pop-off performances in the preseason, players rise. And even though he did go 4 for 10 yards, when it came to the receiving game, 2 receptions, 53 yards and a touchdown, it highlighted exactly how valuable he can be in the receiving game. It showed his big playability, 2 aspects that the Pittsburgh Steelers offense has relied upon their running backs to perform in. Think back to Le'Veon Bell, even as recent as James Conner. When these players are given a workhorse role, they're producing. Najee Harris is going to be no different. Don't get it mistaken. He's one of the safer picks, in my opinion, that you can draft in this range, not to mention at the running back position as a whole. He's got a big body to be able to handle a heavy workload. He stands 6'1", 232 pounds, so he's built like Melvin Gordon. He also runs a 4.53 40. May not sound all that fast, but still faster than many of the running backs in the league. Not to mention for his height adjusted speed score ranks in the 91st percentile, so very much like Derrick Henry, his speed's deceptive. His most comparable player is actually Joe Mixon, and although Joe Mixon as of late has not been producing, I think we all can admit that back in the day, Joe Mixon was looked at as a physical specimen. And as for Najee Harris, I have no fear in putting these high expectations upon him, because I don't foresee a situation where he disappoints where he's being drafted. Alright guys, we're moving into the third player, and the analysis backing him is going to be a bit more simple. It's Gus Edwards of the Baltimore Ravens. This was a player that many of you, if you drafted a bit earlier, even as early as 2 weeks ago, you could have grabbed Gus Edwards outside the top 100, even falling outside the top 120 in some leagues. I know I did 2 early drafts, one of them being the Scott Fish Bowl, another a league with friends from college. In those 2 leagues, I drafted Gus Edwards in those later stages of the draft, and no matter how good of picks I think that the other players on my roster may have been, hands down, there's no competing with getting Gus Edwards at that stage of the draft, now that he's slated to be the top running back for the Baltimore Ravens. As we all know, the unfortunate news of J.K. Dobbins, his season, it's over due to a torn ACL. Unfortunate news as mentioned. I strongly believe that J.K. Dobbins in the same exact offense would have been possibly competing to push for top 10, top 5 numbers at the position. Gus Edwards, while taking over for J.K. Dobbins, he may not have that type of ceiling when it comes to the safety in his floor, because what we can expect from him across the entire season, much like Najee Harris, I find it very difficult for him to disappoint, especially when you factor in where you can get him in the draft, but I'll mention that again in a second. For that, let me go a little bit further into what I mentioned about from a season-long perspective, because Gus Edwards, as we all know, he's not much of a receiving running back. This isn't going to be super detrimental to him. As we know, Baltimore Ravens, they don't truly throw to the running back position all that much. J.K. Dobbins himself, he wasn't expected to have a miraculously high target total for the season. season. So Gus Edwards, a player who has struggled in that area in the past, even with his increased workload, expecting him to just see a jump in production in the receiving game, it's unlikely. And what that means, he's going to have to rely on just rushing yards, rushing touchdowns. Those are going to consist of the majority of his fantasy production. In most cases with running backs in that same situation, their week-to-week volatility is pretty high, usually reliant on a touchdown in order to have a solid fantasy performance and for you not to regret starting them, because even if they rush for 20 attempts, which is a massive touch total, and they're able to put up 90 rushing yards, which is a rate above 4 yards per carry, so super solid in that area as well. At the end of the day, you're only putting up 9 fantasy points without any receptions. So for a running back in that type of situation, you're almost reliant on a touchdown to pay off the start. With most running backs that are facing those type of obstacles, it's difficult to trust them oftentimes. You have to play the matchups with them. But when it comes to Gus Edwards, a player who we know is going to play efficiently, check that box for that one. And with him also being on Baltimore, playing with Lamar Jackson, we know that not only will he be on one of the most efficient offenses when it comes to converting offensive drives into red zone production, we've seen every running back playing behind Lamar Jackson have a lot of success regardless of how much volume they were getting in the receiving game. If Gus Edwards truly does have a stranglehold on this offense, it wouldn't be crazy to even expect him to get double-digit touchdowns, pushing for even 15, I'd say. And then on those offensive performances where they completely dominate, Gus Edwards popping off, even if he has a bit of volatility here and there, he'll more than make up for it in his single week upside. Rushing for 100 plus yards, scoring 2 touchdowns, I can easily see Gus Edwards producing that type of production on several occasions this season. And one of the best parts about him is his ADP hasn't fully settled. Many people still a bit apprehensive to draft him as high as some of the other running backs they've felt comfortable drafting throughout the past months, doing all of their mock drafts. Now they're throwing Gus Edwards in there. He has these negative aspects to him, so they're wondering if they're assuming too much risk with him. And ultimately, that's making him a value in the draft and somebody that all of us know that we had the option to draft, but even when given and faced with the option, many of us simply chose to go with a different player. For those reasons, I think there will be a point in the season where everybody's watching the Baltimore Ravens on primetime, Gus Edwards going off for one of those games I just mentioned. And at that point in time, you'll think back to the time you were on the clock, looking at Gus Edwards on your draft board, knowing you have the option to draft him, and you may be kicking yourself, asking yourself why you didn't pull the trigger. Alright guys, we're moving into the 4th running back on this list. It's Trey Sermon of the San Francisco 49ers. He's a rookie entering one of the best offenses when it comes to rushing production in the entire NFL. They've had success regardless of which running back's been under center. On top of that, he's also entering the offense at one of the best times we've ever seen it in recent years. Not only do they have the most amount of weapons they've had offensively from a wide receiver standpoint, George Kittle, he's heading into the season healthy. In addition to that, they have rookie Trey Lance, who may not start the season, but he also gives them an outlet if Jimmy Garoppolo either gets injured, isn't producing up to par, so it's a safety net for this offense to continue to compete for excellence. So hands down, when it comes to Trey Sermon, it's undeniable he is entering a really good position. On top of that, the running back core that he is joining, although it is going to be somewhat of a committee, it's a committee that often gets injured. While Trey Sermon is not guaranteed anything when it comes to a workload for this upcoming season, he may have the luxury of being on a team that may not have another option. By week 6, by week 10, who's to say that all of the running backs on this team will remain healthy? They haven't had the best track record. The biggest competition, Raheem Mostert, already dealing with injuries himself. Not to mention, he has an extremely late breakout age. He's nearly 29 and a half years old, rushed for 500 yards last season, 700 the year before that, but had virtually no production throughout the rest of his entire career. He's also never received a full workload. On top of that, has never even been able to stay healthy while not even receiving a full workload. So when it comes to putting faith and trust into Raheem Mostert for being healthy and starting for the entire season, it's a fat chance. Those factors inherently increase the value of the other rushers competing for touches in this backfield. Trey Sermon just so happened to be the right guy at the right place at the right time. Even when looking at his own personal skill set, he's not truly excellent at anything. That's not to say he's bad at anything. In fact, I would say he's pretty good at everything, but not great. That can be extremely useful in an offense like the 49ers. They're going to ask a lot out of their running backs, including receiving out of the backfield. That's something he can do. When it comes to elusiveness, he can get it done. He's not going to be the most elusive out there, but he will make plays from time to time. He can break tackles. He's not going to be a bruiser, but he also has decent size. He can handle a workload. So if you're looking for a guy that can really do it in all areas and get it done wherever you ask him, Trey Sermon, he certainly fits the bill. So not only is he the right guy guy at the right place at the right time. He also has exactly the right skill set to be somebody very useful down the stretch for the San Francisco 49ers offense. Not to mention, this offense itself has a habit of inflating the value of the rushers in the backfield. Almost every running back that we've seen given an opportunity has exceeded expectations. I think Trey Sermon will be no different. So when it comes to Raheem Mostert potentially spelling carries away from Trey Sermon, I don't think he'll be able to do all that much to stop it. This is also a team that's going to have many positive game scripts, so that means plenty of rushing production to go around, plenty of opportunities for him to make a name for himself even while the other rushers are healthy. Regardless though, what makes Trey Sermon such a great pick and somebody you'll regret not drafting is he's one of the few running backs, one of the last running backs that you can actually draft in the later stages of the draft that actually has an opportunity to start in week 1, at least receive somewhat of a workload, compete for touches, potentially win the job. Trey Sermon's somebody that brings that to the table, and comparing him to the other players being drafted around him at RB, at that draft spot, we're talking in the handcuff territory. Even looking at ESPN, I'd say one of the most popular draft sites, if not the most popular draft site, Trey Sermon, he's coming off the board outside the top 100. That means you can fill out your entire starting roster, get a couple of bench players, still find your way to get back to Trey Sermon later on in the draft, which means there's almost no risk in the pick of Trey Sermon. And as mentioned, he's somebody that has a very strong chance to pay off his draft price. For that, I think a lot of us were faced with the option to draft Trey Sermon in our leagues, but opted not to for other players. Chop it up to the very common early round draft strategy of going RB heavy, call it whatever you want, but I still think Trey Sermon was one of the few late round values. Looking for a running back drafted after him that can actually produce like Trey Sermon, you're going to have a very difficult time. There's only one other player being drafted later than him that I really think we should have gone out of our way to target. That's going to be the 5th and final player on this list, Rhamondre Stevenson of the New England Patriots. I think many of us are all too familiar with that name now with his preseason performances. He's been one of the shining bright spots in this New England Patriots offense throughout training camp. He's received very high praise, so much so that I can say he was one of, if not the biggest factor in the New England Patriots feeling comfortable with letting go and trading away Sony Michel, not only increasing the fantasy value for him being a running back handcuff, but also increasing the value of Najee Harris, making him somebody that a lot of us can now trust in fantasy leagues. Sony Michel, not really somebody that was doing all that much for the team, so not as much as lost there. I think a lot of us can thank him for the move, including the LA Rams. But the reason I said to draft Rhamondre Stevenson is because this is going to be a player that likely is going to get some sort of volume and workload. The Patriots, they do cycle through running backs. Sony Michel was actually going to be a player that we expected to see some field time, have some touches in the offense. This was going to be alongside Najee Harris. So with Sony Michel now out of the picture, I expect Stevenson to receive some of that volume. And while it may not be enough to support his fantasy production, certainly not enough to trust him starting in our lineups, at least with us seeing him on the field, it's going to give him an opportunity to compete for more touches. He is also going to have the added benefit of being a handcuff behind Najee Harris, a player who we know has dealt with injuries in the past, even looking back at last season not being able to stay healthy. So based on his track record, Rhamondre Stevenson has a very good shot of having some starting weeks this year. Drafting him in the later rounds, even just having him for those weeks, could pay off. Even drafting him as a handcuff for Najee Harris owners. Maybe in a deeper league, that's something you want to do. I don't typically draft handcuffs, and he wouldn't be the one I would handcuff out of my roster, but in a deeper 14-team, 16-team league where you really need to have a starting running back, I could see that being a strategy. But I still think he does deserve some recognition for how he's produced throughout this preseason. Also, the Patriots offense, not only trading away Sony Michel, but also moving over to Mac Jones. This as a whole is going to increase the fantasy value of all the players on the team. There's not going to be Cam Newton vulturing those touchdowns, so the running backs in this offense, they're actually going to potentially have some starter level production. And with the Patriots defense still being up there pushing for elite, a running back tied to a defense like that isn't even going to need an all that strong offense in order to be very productive. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hoped you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.